There are houses that remember, but not in the way poets talk about memory. Not through settling foundations or the language of creaking wood when night temperatures pull sounds from old timber. Instead, they remember the way a wound remembers the blade that made it. Closed, defended, held shut by pressure from within. Back in the winter of 1887, in a farmhouse just outside Harrowfield, Pennsylvania, a family of 6 moved into a property that had been empty for 11 years. Within 4 months, 3 of them would be dead or critically ill. Within 6 months, the county coroner quietly sealed his own report and filed it under a category that didn't exist in any official registry. That property had changed hands 5 times over 46 years. Every single sale was done below market value, and each family that left did so without the kind of public explanation that rural communities back then usually demanded from their neighbors. Nobody offered any explanation either. Something passed with the deed from one set of hands to the next. Not a defect in the timber or the foundation, but a presence inside the structure itself. Something compressed, sealed, and ancient, in the way that violations of the deepest human order can become ancient within just 1 decade. What investigators eventually found beneath the main parlor floor wasn't a cellar. It wasn't a root storage room either. This space had no door, no ventilation that could be identified from any outside look at the building, and no entrance except the one that had been nailed shut from above. Deliberately, carefully, with such precision that the person who sealed it knew exactly what they were trapping inside. And they understood that whatever was in there needed to stay there. What follows is the account of the Varnell family, the house on Cutter's Ridge Road, and the thing that had been waiting, patient, silent, and utterly human, for someone to finally pull up those boards. Before we continue, if you've never heard this account before, you're not alone. It was buried for nearly a century in county records that were never meant to go public. Subscribe to the Fear Sermon so you never miss a story that history tried to forget. And tell us in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? The region of western Pennsylvania that holds Harrowfield Township sits in a narrow valley between ridges that run roughly northeast to southwest. That kind of landscape makes a community feel closed in without being totally isolated. They're connected to the wider world by roads that cut through the gaps between hills. But from inside, you're always framed by high ground on every horizon. By the 1880s, the area had seen enough decades of economic ambition and partial collapse to give it this strange atmosphere of a place that had expected more from itself. The hills had been stripped of their best timber by the mid-1860s. After 2 decades of sawmill operations that seemed like the start of a permanent industry, but turned out to be the fast consumption of a limited resource. The sawmills opened and closed within the same decade. A rail spur was proposed, surveyed by a team of engineers whose visit caused a lot of local excitement, and then quietly dropped when the company financing it fell apart under what the Clement Courier called irregularities in the accounts of the principal officers. Coal was found in amounts that encouraged speculation, but not enough to make it worthwhile at a large scale. The land, stripped of its most useful resources, went back to its second purpose, farming, and the slow, patient work of making poor ground produce enough to feed the families working it. What remained in Harrowfield in the 1880s was a community of about 400 people. They were connected to the bigger town of Kellerton by 12 miles of road that followed the valley floor and became completely impassable for 6 to 8 weeks every winter. The freeze, thaw cycles, and heavy wagon traffic turned the surface into something closer to a natural geological feature than an actual road. The people of Harrowfield weren't unusual. They were the ordinary result of a certain kind of American life. Mostly Protestant. Careful with money the way people are when financial mistakes have consequences that last for generations. Suspicious of strangers like communities that learned to rely on themselves, and deeply invested in each other's business the way people are when they know their survival depends on each other. They held church twice on Sundays. They kept detailed records of land transfers, debts, crop yields, and births and deaths. They remembered things, who sold what, for how much, and under what circumstances. And they talked about those things the way people do, when they understand that their neighbor's economic history is practical knowledge, useful for judging risk and spotting opportunities. The property on Cutter's Ridge Road had a recorded history going back to 1841, when a man named Absalom Pruitt filed a deed for 43 acres in the eastern part of the township and started building the main house that same season. Pruitt had come to Harrowfield from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania 5 years earlier, and in that time he had built a reputation as one of the most capable craftsmen in the area. He was a carpenter by trade, but he had the range of practical skills that frontier life in early 19th century America demanded from anyone who wanted to be useful. He could set stone, read a grade, dig a foundation, shape green timber into solid framing, and turn seasoned wood into fine furniture. He was known to be meticulous. Several structures he built or worked on in Harrowfield were still standing in the 1880s, and men who knew carpentry could point to his work by the consistency of the joinery and the care he put into parts of the build that most builders figured were invisible once the walls went up. The foundation of any Pruitt-built structure was set with the same attention as the visible front of the house. The framing was straight and true in ways that were hard to achieve and easy to ignore. He built as though the inside of the wall, the hidden skeleton, mattered just as much as the surface. The house he built on Cutter's Ridge Road showed that character completely. It was a farmhouse with a standard design, for its time 2 stories, 4 rooms on the ground floor, a sleeping loft upstairs, a cellar you could reach through a door in the kitchen floor, and a covered porch on the south side. But it was built with a level of detail that neighbors talked about when they visited during construction. The foundation was fitted stone, dry, laid with the skill of a man who understood load distribution and how frost heave worked in the specific soil of that valley. The main floor joists were large, well-seasoned white oak, set close together and notched into the sill plate in a way that spread the weight across the whole foundation. The floors, once laid, were level and tight, with no visible gaps between boards and no difference in thickness that would cause humps or hollows when walked on. In the language of the trade, it was a dead floor, solid, dense, and acoustically deadened by its own mass and the quality of the installation. Pruitt lived on the property with his wife Constance and their 4 children from late 1842 until 1858, when he sold to a family named Doherty and moved west. His neighbors later described, in scattered recollections, that he left with a degree of urgency that didn't match anything visible at the time. There was no public conflict, no financial crisis anyone could point to. The harvest that year had been fine. Pruitt's business was steady. He announced in the spring that he was leaving, and by the end of June the deed was transferred. The goods were packed, and the Pruitts were gone. The price the Dohertys paid was noticeably lower than what the property should have been worth. The house alone, given Pruitt standards, should have set a higher floor for any negotiation. But there was no negotiation. Pruitt named a price, the Dohertys paid it, and the deal was finished fast, so fast it suggested both sides had reasons to want it done quickly. The deed transfer was recorded. The line in the county register was clean, no strings attached. What wasn't recorded was everything else. The Dohertys stayed 11 years. Patrick Doherty was an Irish-born farmer who came to Pennsylvania through New York a decade before the Civil War, part of the huge wave of immigration the Irish famine set off in the 1840s. He was a solid farmer, a steady churchgoer, and a man with no particular fame or bad reputation. His wife Ellen was quieter and more observant. Neighbors who knew the family well said she was someone who noticed things. Not just what she saw, but the quality of silence in a room as much as the sounds. They had 6 children when they bought the house, and lost 2 to fever within the first 3 years. That wasn't unusual back then, when childhood fevers were a constant threat in rural areas with no reliable medicine. But people noted it because 2 deaths in 3 years was on the high end of normal loss. A third child, a boy named Dermot, who was 8 at the time of the purchase, died in 1865 in what the county register called a fall of indeterminate cause. The register usually spelled out accident details: a fall from a barn loft into a creek while cutting timber. That phrase, indeterminate cause, almost never appeared, and when it did, it was usually in cases where some ambiguity was useful. But for Dermot Doherty, no extra detail was recorded, and no investigation seems to have happened. Patrick Doherty sold the property in 1869 and moved his surviving family to Allegheny County. He didn't advertise the sale, which was strange at a time when land transfers usually got talked about ahead of time so interested buyers could come forward. The buyer wasn't from Harrowfield or Kellerton. He was a Pittsburgh speculator named Clarence Fitch, who bought the property through an agent and never visited it once during his ownership. A woman named Harriet Cleves, who had been friendly with Ellen Doherty over those 11 years, later told her daughter, when the daughter was 50, and the telling felt like a secret held a long time and only partly let go, that Ellen Doherty wept the day they finally left, not because she was sad about leaving a place she loved. The weeping, as Harriet understood it, was the relief of a woman putting distance between herself and something she had never been able to name directly, something she lived with for 11 years by learning not to look straight at it. The relief of departure was the relief of getting away from something she understood at some level was there, without ever being able to say what it was. Harriet Cleves never went into the Doherty house. She visited twice in their early years for the kind of social calls rural women exchanged, and she never went back. She told her daughter there was a room in that house, the parlor with the eastern wall, that she could never sit in comfortably, even just for a visit. Not because of anything she could see or name. She said it was the quality of the air in that room. It sat in your chest differently than air in other rooms or other houses. She thought about it for many years after, and the closest she could come to a description was that the air felt used, like it had been breathed so many times, by so many people under such extreme conditions, that it had taken on its own character. Not just stale, but altered, pressed into a different shape by the force of what had passed through it. Harriet was a practical woman with no mystical leanings. She found her own description embarrassing and said so, but she had lived 70 years by trusting what her body told her about spaces and situations. And her body told her, across 2 visits to that parlor, that something in the air was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with ventilation or the season. She didn't know what was under the floor. She only knew what she felt, and she felt it wasn't right. The property sat empty from 1869 to 1880. Clarence Fitch paid the county taxes without any apparent interest in using the land. In 1880, he sold to a Harrowfield farmer named George Utterback for a price that, again came in below what the county assessor thought the land was worth. Utterback used the acreage for grazing, running a small herd of beef cattle on the grass that had grown back during the vacancy. But he refused to live in the house. When neighbors asked why, he gave different answers at different times. The house needed too much work. It was in the wrong spot relative to his other land, or it was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the season and everything to do with some quality in its construction he could never identify. He wasn't a man given to vague talk. He was a methodical, economically sensible farmer, the kind the region produced plenty of. His refusal to live in a solid farmhouse on land he owned didn't fit his established character. Nobody pressed him too hard on it. There was one incident during Utterback's ownership that he told his brother-in-law about shortly after it happened, and then apparently never mentioned again. He went to the house in the fall of 1881 to fix a broken window latch. The kind of routine maintenance an empty building sometimes needs, which he handled as a practical matter, not because he cared about the place, but because a deteriorating structure loses value faster than it should. He went in the early afternoon in good weather alone. In the main parlor near the eastern wall, he found that several floorboards had been disturbed, not broken or rotted out from below in a way that would show surface damage. Lifted and reset. That was the only accurate description. The boards had been raised, and then put back by someone who tried to return them to their original position, but couldn't match the precision of the first installation. The grain was off. The boards sat slightly higher than their neighbors. To someone who didn't look closely, it was just a floor. To someone who had looked before and knew what it was supposed to look like, something had changed. Utterback didn't investigate further that day. He replaced the window latch, hammered down the loose boards with heavier nails than the originals, and left. He went back twice over the next few weeks to check that the boards hadn't been disturbed again. They hadn't. He told his brother-in-law about it and said, in a tone the brother-in-law remembered as carefully controlled, that he believed someone had been using the house, using it for something, and that he didn't intend to find out what. He sold the property in October 1887 to a man named Clement Varnell for $212. The county assessor noted the sale price in the margin of the transfer record with a single word: curious. Clement Varnell was 41 when he brought his family to Cutter's Ridge Road. He had spent 12 years as a foreman in a glass manufacturing plant outside Pittsburgh, a job that fit his temperament well. The work required steady attention to process, the ability to manage a crew without friction or weakness, and a tolerance for the constant low-level danger of molten material and extreme heat. He was good at it, and the work treated him fairly until the company cut orders after a shift in the regional economy, and management decided to reduce the workforce by a quarter. That took Clement out of a job he had expected to keep until he chose to leave. The severance was small. The family's savings were enough to get through a transition. His wife's cousin mentioned a property in western Pennsylvania that could be bought cheap. The cousin had heard about it secondhand and didn't know its history in any detail. Clement went to look at it alone in September 1887, walked every room, pressed his thumb into every visible joint, and studied the foundation from every angle outside. He found it solid. Better than solid. He found the work of a builder who approached his craft with the same serious, systematic attitude Clement had always brought to his own work. He recognized in that structure the evidence of a mind he understood intuitively. He didn't ask about the price. He didn't negotiate. He paid what they asked and moved his family in within 6 weeks. It was the most important practical decision of his life, and he made it the way capable men of his era often made big decisions, based on what he could see and verify, without enough attention to what he couldn't see. Margit Varnell was 37, a woman whose parents had come from the Dalarna region of Sweden in the early 1850s. They settled first in New York, and then followed the Swedish migration route southwest into Pennsylvania's industrial belt. She grew up bilingual, and Swedish stayed the language of her inner emotional life. Even after decades in America, made English the language of her daily world. She was quiet in the specific way of someone who learned that watching was more useful than talking. She observed situations develop and formed her opinions privately before putting them into words, which meant when she did speak, it was usually to say something she had already thought through carefully. By the standards of her community, she was unusually self-possessed, neither dependent on her husband's certainty nor threatened by it, able to form her own conclusions without needing his approval. Their oldest child, was 17, a broad-shouldered, careful young man who had inherited his father's practical intelligence, but not his tendency to commit quickly. Thought before he acted, which made him cautious when speed was needed, but thorough when patience paid off. He was the child who looked most like Clement physically and least like him in temperament. Their second child, Lena, was 14, bookish in the way rural girls could sometimes manage, if a school was close enough and a parent valued education enough to make the effort. She had her mother's observational quality, but was more willing to say what she saw. The two youngest were boys, Oscar and Per, 9 and 7, named for grandfathers on the Swedish side, in a way that Margit's parents understood as the proper recognition of roots in a country they would never go back to. The family arrived in November and spent the first weeks doing the practical work of settling into a new place. Clement and worked on the outbuildings, which needed more attention than the house itself. The barn roof had a section where the boards had warped away from the rafters, and 3 fence lines needed new posts where the originals had rotted at ground level. The house itself needed cleaning more than repairs. Margit and Lena worked through it room by room, with the thoroughness a woman of Margit's upbringing brought to such tasks, removing the leftover residue of 11 years of emptiness, dead insects, mouse droppings, cobwebs thick enough in the corners to look like construction instead of neglect, and that specific surface grime that settles onto horizontal surfaces in an empty space and eventually bonds to them chemically. The cleaning took several days. Each room came out visibly clean, smelling of the lye soap and beeswax Margit used, with no sign of what it had been before. Except the parlor. The parlor was clean after Margit's work, but it didn't smell clean. It smelled of something underneath, something the soap and beeswax sat on top of without reaching the deeper layer. Margit noticed this and blamed old wood and the trapped vapor of a sealed space. She hung curtains on the eastern wall, moved the heaviest furniture to cover the slightly uneven floorboards, and told Clement about the boards. He said he would deal with them in the spring. She accepted that and moved on to the next task, until winter settled around the farmhouse with the special authority of Pennsylvania winters in that valley country. Not the dramatic snowfalls of the mountains, but a persistent gray, damp cold that worked its way into structures and bodies alike with a patient thoroughness harder to defend against than any single storm. The house held heat well enough in most rooms, but unevenly. The north-facing bedrooms, where the boys slept, needed the wood stove running constantly to stay livable. And even then the outer corners of those rooms held a cold that seemed to resist the warmth, without quite being defeated by it. The family adapted the way farm families of that era adapted to everything, more layers inside. Sitting closer to heat sources in the evenings, accepting conditions as just the ordinary negotiation of winter in a farmhouse. The first sign that something was wrong came in January. Oscar started waking in the middle of the night and coming to his parents' room, which he hadn't done since he was tiny. He complained of headaches, not the sharp kind from a cold, but a pressure behind his eyes that he described, with the limited words of a 9-year-old, as feeling like his head was being pushed on from inside. The pain was worse in the mornings than at night, worse indoors than outside, and worse, though nobody made the connection at the time, in the parlor than anywhere else. Margit took his temperature and found it slightly elevated, not enough for a serious fever, but enough to suggest an illness was starting. She moved his sleeping spot away from the outer wall, where the cold was worst, and watched him closely. The headaches continued. The temperature went up and down in a pattern that didn't match any illness she recognized. Per started showing similar symptoms in February. The timing, one child declining, then a second showing the same early signs, suggested to Margit an infectious cause, something that passed from Oscar to his younger brother through sharing a bed. That was the rational explanation, and she held on to it while also noting, in the careful private inventory she kept, that Per's symptoms weren't identical to Oscar's. Per wasn't feverish the way Oscar had been. Per was confused. Not suddenly or dramatically like a child with a high fever, but gradually, incrementally, like someone whose perceptions were being changed by something slow and cumulative. He lost track of conversations. He repeated questions he had asked minutes before. He sat at supper some evenings, with an expression Margit described to herself, and later to Clement, as looking like a child listening to something no one else could hear. Clement noticed the same quality in both boys at supper one evening in late February, and the feeling that went through him in that moment was one he hadn't felt since a specific day at the glassworks. He had looked at a section of the furnace wall and understood, before he could have explained why, that the refractory material was compromised in a way not yet visible on the surface, but that would become catastrophically visible if not fixed. It was the feeling of a capable man recognizing the early signature of a failure he didn't yet understand in a system he was responsible for. He looked at his sons across the supper table. He said their names. It took 2 tries before either of them responded. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in the dark thinking about the parlor, the smell that stayed under the cleaning, the board someone had lifted and reset before him, the room under the floor that he hadn't told Margit about in any detail, and the iron rings in the stone of the eastern wall that he had been pretending for 3 months he could think about later. He told himself he would understand them in context, once he did more research, once spring came, and he could investigate properly. He told himself that because the alternative, understanding them in the only context their design naturally suggested, was an understanding that would force him to act. And he hadn't been ready to act. He hadn't been ready to be the man who moved his family into a house with iron rings in a sealed room under the parlor floor. The smell from the eastern wall got stronger in March as the thaw began. It was stronger than in the fall, stronger than Margit's description of old wood and sealed air had allowed for, and it carried something she couldn't place into any category of organic decay she had encountered before. It wasn't the smell of a dead animal in the walls. She knew that smell, and it had a direction, a point of origin you could find and fix. This smell was spread out. It came from the floor itself, from the gap between the boards and whatever was underneath. and it carried something in its lower register that she found herself not wanting to investigate because she had learned over a winter of careful observation that the things in this house, without ordinary explanations, were connected in ways she hadn't fully mapped yet. She told Clement the smell had to be dealt with. Clement agreed. On the morning of March 19, 1888, he and Old moved the furniture away from the eastern wall and started examining the floor. What they found in the first 15 minutes stopped both of them cold. The boards nearest the wall had been opened before. Not once, but multiple times. The evidence was in the nail patterns if you knew to look. The original nailing was consistent, regular intervals, the same gauge throughout, the work of a careful hand. Over those original nail holes, 2 later sets of nails had been driven, each at slightly different intervals, each a slightly different gauge, each going into positions that almost, but didn't quite match the originals. Someone had opened the floor at least twice after the original installation. Someone had put the boards back each time, pressing them into place with enough care to make the disturbance not obvious, but not enough care to restore the original precision. The grain was off by fractions. The boards sat slightly higher than their neighbors. To Clement's eye, the eye of a man who had spent his working life judging the precision of other men's work, the differences were impossible to miss. He pried up the first board. The smell that rose from below was a concentrated version of what had been seeping through the floor for months. The same character, but without the dilution of the boards, and without the filtering effect of the wood and gaps. It was enough to make Old step back and press his sleeve to his face. Clement didn't step back. He pried up the second board and the third. He called for Old to bring a lantern. The lantern, held down through the opening on its chain, cast its light into a space that wasn't a crawl space, wasn't a cellar, wasn't anything the normal vocabulary of residential construction had a comfortable word for. It was a room of deliberate, measured dimensions, about 8 feet in one direction, and what looked like 10 or more in the other, the full length not visible from the opening. The floor was packed earth. The walls were the same fitted stone as the exterior foundation, the same dry, laid construction, clearly the same hand, the same care. The ceiling was the underside of the parlor floor, reinforced from below with extra joists running opposite to the main floor framing, creating a layered structure significantly heavier than the floor above needed for any load-bearing purpose. That extra reinforcement served a different function. It made the floor above denser, heavier, less responsive to sound transmitted through the framing. It made the parlor above quieter from below. Whatever happened in that room wouldn't be audible in any normal way in the room above. Along the eastern wall, which was the exterior foundation wall, iron rings were set into the stone at intervals of about 4 feet. 3 rings set at a height Clement measured, without wanting to think about what the measurement meant, at about 3.5 feet from the ground, a height consistent with a specific posture, a height consistent with a specific use. He held the lantern steady for a long time and looked at the rings. They weren't decorative. They weren't functional in any ordinary way iron rings might be part of a storage space. They were heavy, well mounted, set with the same care as everything else, set to hold something that pushed against them with sustained force. There was no ambiguity about their purpose if you let yourself see it. Clement put the boards back. He told Old they would talk about it inside. He didn't talk about it with Margaret or Lena. He went to the barn alone and sat in the cold for a long time. When he came in for supper, he told his family that the smell came from an old drainage problem that a previous owner had sealed wrong, and that he would fix it in the spring when the ground allowed the work. Margit looked at him across the table in that particular way she had. The way that meant she had heard the incomplete version and was deciding whether to wait for the full one. She said nothing. She understood that some things a man needed to carry for a while before he could put them into words without breaking something. She waited. She would say years later that the supper table that evening was the last moment she experienced the house as something that might still turn out ordinary. After that, she was just waiting for the shape of what she already, at some level, understood. What Clement couldn't have known from the deed records and county transfer documents was the specific operational history of what that room was built to do. That knowledge existed spread across the memories of several people still living in the region in 1888, and in the private papers of at least one person who had died 14 years earlier. But it had never made it into any official record, because the man who built the room had been extremely careful about what he wrote down and what he let others understand about his purposes. Absalom Pruitt, who built the house on Cutter's Ridge Road in 1841 and 1842, wasn't just a carpenter. He wasn't just a careful man and a skilled craftsman and a church-going member of his community. For about 12 years, he operated a specific kind of facility, a holding and transit space for human beings who had been captured while trying to escape slavery and were being held invisibly while the paperwork to send them back into bondage was finished and the travel arrangements south were made. The language of that era had several terms for what Pruitt did, but the formal legal term was recovery agent, and it had legal standing. The Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850 created a framework where men like Pruitt operated under the color of law, doing what they and their legal supporters consistently framed as the legitimate enforcement of property rights established by the U.S. Constitution. The network Pruitt worked within stretched through several Pennsylvania counties and connected through intermediaries to agents in Maryland and Virginia who did the actual capture work. Pruitt's role was intermediate and logistical. He provided a location where captured people could be held without public visibility in a county that wasn't the county of capture, while the legal papers needed for transport south were gathered, verified, and signed by the right magistrates. Pennsylvania was a free state, but federal law overruled state law on this specific question, and there were magistrates in western Pennsylvania in the 1840s and 1850s willing to sign those papers if they were presented correctly. The room had been built for that purpose. Every element of its construction reflected what it was for. The acoustic reinforcement of the ceiling so sounds from below wouldn't reach the living space above. The lack of any ventilation visible from outside. The iron rings set at a height for securing people in a specific posture. The dimensions, large enough to hold several people for several days, but small enough to be invisible in any architectural examination. The packed earth floor, which absorbed moisture and biological residue, without the staining and odor retention wood or stone would show. The sealed entrance disguised as ordinary flooring in a room that served the ordinary social function of a parlor. A room where visitors would sit, where the surface of respectability was maintained above a space where the machinery of that respectability's opposite was hidden. People had been held in that room. The records Clement would later find in the packed earth of the southeast corner documented specific transactions. Names or partial names, dates, amounts, outcomes. The records covered a period from 1843 to about 1856 and showed at least 17 separate transactions as Pruitt logged them. The outcomes column used 3 categories: returned as arranged, delivered to connection in Hagerstown, and matter closed. That third category appeared 4 times. What, matter closed, meant in Pruitt's accounting wasn't defined in the ledger. It wasn't defined anywhere in the available record. It was the kind of phrase that does the job of a definition while actively refusing to give one. A sealed door in language serving the same purpose as the sealed boards in the parlor floor. The illness moving through the Varnell household since January wasn't a supernatural thing. It wasn't a haunting in any sense that needed a vocabulary beyond the physical. It was chemistry. That sealed room, after 4 decades of closure, had become a slow-release storehouse of compounds the sciences of the 1880s didn't yet have a full way to understand. Organic material, biological traces, the atmospheric residue of a confined space that had held frightened human bodies for days and weeks under extreme physiological stress. What fear does to a human body over days and weeks isn't just psychological. It's chemical. It's hormonal. It shows up in the breath, the sweat, every biological output of a body in sustained crisis. Multiply that across 17 documented transactions, across the specific biology of the packed earth floor and the sealed stone walls. Accumulated over 40 years of closure, that room had become a kind of chemical record of its own history. Not metaphysically, not spiritually, physically, in the air. In the particles that the slight seasonal movement of the boards had been releasing gradually and invisibly into the living space above. The headaches Oscar and Per were having were neurological, consistent with low-level exposure to compounds that in higher amounts would have caused worse effects. The confusion, the emotional ups and downs, the unfocused attention their father noticed at supper, those were symptoms. They were the body's response to something in the air of that house that the medicine of the era had no tool to detect and no language to name. Dr. Hartwell Brosius, when he came to see Oscar in early April, could identify the symptom cluster, but not the cause. He used the word miasma, the old pre-germ theory term for bad air, because it was the closest language available. He said the children needed outdoor air. He said whatever was causing the smell in the eastern parlor needed to be fixed. He didn't go under the boards. Clement didn't show him the room. The conversation stayed at the level of ventilation, drainage, and the family needing to keep the kids outdoors as much as spring weather allowed. Oscar Varnell died on April 29, 1888. He was 9 years old. The cause of death Brosius recorded was brain fever, a category that covered a range of neurological declines the medicine of that time couldn't tell apart more specifically. He had been sick for 3 months, with a progression that sped up sharply in his final 3 weeks, moving from headaches and confusion to seizures and long stretches of unconsciousness the family watched over without any resources to help except being there. He was buried in the Harrowfield Lutheran Cemetery on May 1. Old dug the grave because Clement couldn't bring himself to do it, and Margit wouldn't let Clement tell Old why his father couldn't dig his own brother's grave. Per got critically ill within 2 weeks of Oscar's death. The progression was faster than with Oscar, as if the thing causing the illness had refined itself through the first child, or as if Per's smaller body made him more vulnerable. Margit, who by now had built a connection in her mind, she couldn't yet fully say out loud, but could no longer ignore. Between the boards, the smell, the children's decline, the eastern parlor that never smelled clean, no matter how many times she cleaned it, made a decision without asking Clement. She packed Per's things on a Wednesday evening and took him the next morning to her sister's house in Kellerton, 12 miles away. Clement didn't argue. He was past arguing. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his wife load Per into the wagon And he didn't ask when she would be back because he understood that his wife was doing the only clearly right thing that had been done in that house since November. Per recovered slowly. The headaches came back for months after he left the house, then gradually, over about a year, faded and mostly stopped. He would carry a lifelong sensitivity, a tendency toward headaches in confined spaces or poorly ventilated rooms that his doctors, when he was old enough to see doctors on his own, couldn't connect to any identified underlying condition. The connection was there, but it existed in the gap between what had happened to his body in that house and what the medicine of his era had the tools to see. Clement stayed in the house. Lena stayed with her father, because Clement wouldn't send her away without an explanation, and the explanation wasn't fully formed yet. Through April and into May, Lena started showing what Brosius called nervous exhaustion. A tiredness that wasn't fatigue from illness in the usual sense, but something more fundamental. As if the ordinary energy of a young body just wouldn't respond to its usual sources of replenishment. She slept and woke up tired. She sat down to tasks and forgot what she meant to do. She developed a sensitivity to sound that made the normal noise of a working farm. Animals, tools, weather on the roof. Physically painful in a way she couldn't explain, and that had nothing to do with any previous sensitivity. Clement watched his daughter decline over 3 weeks in May and understood, with the specific torment of a man who recognizes a danger he failed to stop, that spring had come too late. He had meant to investigate the room properly. He had meant to find the explanation that would let him decide what to do. Spring came, and his son was in the ground, and his daughter was sick in a house above a room with iron rings in the wall, and he had waited too long. He went back into the room in the second week of June. He went alone in the middle of the afternoon with 2 lanterns, a carpenter's rule, and a short-handled spade. He spent 2 hours under the boards. He measured every surface. He examined the iron rings with the full attention he had been withholding since March. He moved along the perimeter with 1 lantern held close to the wall, not looking for anything the first examination had missed. In the southeast corner, where the stone of the 2 walls met at a right angle, he noticed a dip in the earth floor, about 4 inches lower than the surrounding area, roughly 2 feet square, with an edge too precise to be natural settling. He took the spade and broke the surface carefully. At 8 inches down, the spade hit something that wasn't stone or root. He reached into the hole and pulled up a cloth, wrapped bundle packed into the cavity with care. The cloth was folded over the contents and pressed flat to keep a low profile. It had deteriorated badly over 4 decades in the ground, coming apart in sections as he lifted it, and releasing a smell of mold and compressed age. The contents were intact, a collection of folded papers, about 40 sheets of different sizes, bound with cord that had decayed almost to the point of breaking. The papers had been wrapped in cloth, and then again in something, oilcloth or treated leather. He couldn't tell. That had kept moisture out well enough to preserve the writing despite the decades. He took them up into the light and read them. They were records, not letters, not a personal account, not any form of document that carried the heat of individual emotion. Records, in the manner of a man who had learned to document his professional activities for legal protection and financial accountability, using the flat, transactional language of commerce applied to human beings. Names where names were available. Physical descriptions where names weren't. Dates. Amounts paid by unnamed parties for services rendered. References to other agents and locations, the Chester County connection, the Lancaster agent. Delivered to the party in Hagerstown as arranged. Consigned to the gentleman from Baltimore. References to outcomes in the 3 categories Pruitt used returned as arranged. Delivered to Hagerstown, matter closed. 4 entries in that 3rd category, no elaboration. The ledger covered the years 1843 through 1856. The handwriting consistent throughout. The same small, neat, businesslike hand. The same lack of emotion. The same quality of a man who had organized himself around the idea that what he was doing was legitimate commerce, and that documenting commerce was a form of legal protection. Clement Varnell sat on the packed earth floor of that room for a long time holding those papers. He wasn't a man of scholarly background. He had left school at 12. But he could read, and he could understand what he was reading, and he understood it completely by the time he climbed back through the gap in the parlor floor, replaced the boards, and sent Lena to Kellerton that evening. He went to the constable, Rudolf Fenstermacher, the next morning. He laid the papers on Fenstermacher's desk and told him where they had been found and how. He described the room and the rings. He answered Fenstermacher's 3 questions completely. He agreed to Fenstermacher's request that he say nothing to anyone until they could talk to county authorities. He shook the constable's hand and walked back to his farmhouse and sat in the barn for the rest of the afternoon. What Fenstermacher understood when he read the ledger was what Clement had understood, plus the extra layer of local knowledge Fenstermacher had picked up in 9 years as constable. A layer that included certain names, certain families, certain institutional connections the ledger pointed toward indirectly, but without enough precision to prove legal liability, without more evidence. The ledger wasn't enough by itself. It was deeply suggestive. It named a network, but didn't name the network's living members with the specificity a prosecution would need. What it did do, what made it significant beyond its historical value and dangerous beyond its evidentiary value, was connect a set of Pennsylvania locations, and by implication a set of Pennsylvania families, to a federal criminal enterprise that had operated under color of law, but that had, since the 13th Amendment and the end of the war, become definitively criminal in its historical character. The men the ledger gestured toward weren't men who had simply held political positions the law had since condemned. They were men, or their fathers and uncles were men, who had taken part in specific transactions involving specific human beings, documented in Pruitt's businesslike hand, and that could potentially be traced through other county records, other correspondence, other witnesses who might still be alive. The consultation took 6 weeks. County officials came to see Fenstermacher. Fenstermacher told Clement the matter was being reviewed. Concrete was poured into the room under the parlor by workmen from Kellerton in late August, sealing the floor permanently. The county coroner's report on Oscar Varnell's death, which Brosius had submitted with a handwritten note, attached expressing his unease that the specific pattern of the boy's decline was connected to conditions in the house and deserved investigation, was refiled under an administrative category not specifically designed to bury it, but that had the practical effect of making it hard to find. The ledger itself disappeared into a county administrative file with a reference number and no corresponding description in the main index. Clement got the papers back from Fenstermacher in October with a cover letter from a county administrator, whose name Clement couldn't later clearly remember, explaining that the county had reviewed the documents, found them to be historical in nature, and decided no current legal proceeding was justified. The letter used the phrase, "matter closed," a phrase that, given the ledger's own use of the same words, may or may not have been chosen deliberately. Clement didn't ask. He sold the property in October 1888 for $180. 30 $2 less than he had paid the year before, and moved his family to Allegheny County. He never returned to Harrowfield. He never spoke publicly about the house or what had been found in it. Margit outlived him by 11 years. In the last year of her life, when she was 69 and mostly stuck in the house from arthritis that had been getting worse for a decade, she dictated a series of letters to Lena, not for sharing, she said, just for keeping. The letters talked about the house on Cutters Ridge Road in a level of detail and directness she had never managed in 40 years of living with the experience. She described the parlor the first day she cleaned it, the quality of the air, the night she lay awake in late winter and understood, with a clarity that came all at once rather than bit by bit, that what she was smelling from under the eastern wall wasn't wood or drainage. She described the supper table the night Clement came back from the barn and told them about the drainage problem, and how she had understood that her husband was protecting her from something by not telling her, and that the thing he was protecting her from was something he hadn't yet found the shape of himself. She described loading Per into the wagon. She described Clement's face in the doorway. She wrote, the worst part wasn't what had been done in that room. The worst part was understanding that the house had been passed from one family to the next for 40 years, each time a little cheaper than before, and that somewhere in the county, in the township, in the business of men talking to men in places where women weren't present, there had always been people who knew or suspected enough to know that the price meant something, that the cheapness of the house wasn't ignorance, that the ignorance was chosen, that what my children breathed was the air of a room that could have been opened decades before we came to it, and that the reason it wasn't opened was that opening it would have required a conversation no one was ready to have. She wrote, the horror wasn't that something inhuman had been done. The horror was that it had been done carefully by a man who went to church and kept records, knowing the records weren't kept from shame, but from the need to prove the accounts were settled. She put down the pen after that sentence and didn't speak for some time. Lena, who was transcribing, waited. Cornelia Faltz was 63 in 1927 when a county clerk named Wallace Hederman found the file and wrote to her. She had been documenting the history of freedom and its suppression in western Pennsylvania for 15 years, and she had learned in that time to read the administrative record with the special attention of someone who understood that the most important information in an archive is often the information that's been misfiled. A misfiled file isn't necessarily an accident. A file moved from one reference system to another without cross-referencing isn't necessarily incompetence. The archive reflects the intentions of the people who organized it, and those people had intentions that weren't always written down. She had developed, over 15 years, a fine sense for the difference between a file that had been lost and a file that had been misplaced in a specific direction. She spent 2 days with Pruitt's ledger and the surrounding documents. She took careful notes. She identified, from the combination of partial names, location references, dates, and cross-referencing those elements against other records she had spent years collecting, 4 individuals or institutions that could be connected to the transactions in Pruitt's ledger with what she considered reasonable confidence. 2 were dead. 1 was alive, an elderly man of considerable local standing in a town 30 miles from Harrowfield. A retired businessman whose family name appeared in the ledger in a form that matched a connection to the Lancaster network, mentioned in one of Pruitt's entries. The 4th reference was to a specific building, a property still standing and operating in a different capacity in 1927 that could be linked to at least 2 of the documented transactions. She wrote a report. She sent it to a regional historical journal that published work on the pre-war period. The journal accepted it provisionally, then put it on hold for more review, then turned it down without a specific explanation. She sent it to 2 other academic journals. Both said no. She sent it to a Pittsburgh newspaper, where an editor seemed genuinely interested, and then became unreachable. She spent 4 years trying to place the report somewhere with public reach. And across those 4 years, she watched the specific set of obstacles she ran into and thought carefully about what the pattern of those obstacles told her about who in the region was still invested in the particular silence the Pruitt ledger could break. In 1931 she died. Her papers went to her niece and eventually in 1935 to a regional historical society that cataloged them correctly and completely and put them in a reading room where any researcher with a legitimate reason could access them. Several did over the following decades, but their work never gained enough momentum to move the report from the archive into the public record in any lasting way. The house on Cutter's Ridge Road burned in 1901, when a barn fire spread in dry conditions and reached the main structure before anyone could stop it. The walls that remained standing were pulled down by the new owner. The concrete slab poured in the summer of 1888 wasn't disturbed. It sat under the rubble of the demolished walls, and then under the dirt of later seasons, invisible, unmarked on any survey. The iron rings were under the concrete. The packed earth that had held Pruitt's ledger was under the concrete. The specific geography of what had happened in that room over 12 years was preserved physically under about 3 feet of accumulated material on a piece of land that had been bought and sold and reclassified and renamed until the connection between the surface and what lay beneath it was, to anyone looking at the available records, functionally invisible. Old Varnell was interviewed in 1939 by Cornelia Faltz's niece, who was trying to continue her aunt's work. He was 58. He said he didn't remember the house clearly. He had been too young, and the memories he had were the compressed, emotionally heavy ones of early childhood that don't turn into the kind of detailed, sequential account useful for historical testimony. But he remembered the smell. He said it wasn't a smell that fit any ordinary category of household odor. Not wood, not earth, not decay in the usual sense. He said he had encountered it only once more in his adult life, in a specific place in France in 1918, in circumstances he didn't describe in detail. He said the 2 smells were, as far as he could remember, exactly the same. He said, "It's the smell of people who were afraid for a long time in a small place. I didn't know that when I was 7. I know it now." He didn't say anything more about it. He thanked Cornelia Faltz's niece for her time, went back to his house, and didn't answer her follow-up letters. What do you think really happened to those 4 entries marked "Matter closed" in Absalom Pruitt's ledger? What does it mean that these records survived every attempt to bury them in the earth, in the filing system, in the indifference of institutions that preferred their histories clean? And what does it mean that the house was sold again and again at prices that reflected something to families who were never told what that something was? Leave your answer below. If this story gave you something to think about, or something to lose sleep over, share it with someone who needs to understand that the most disturbing histories aren't the ones that can't be explained, but the ones that can. Subscribe to the Fear Sermon, hit the notification bell, and we'll see you in the next one.